In 714 BCE, the Assyrian king Sargon II marched his army into the foothills near Lake Urmia in what is now northwestern Iran and captured the city of Uhlu. He expected to find a settlement starved by the surrounding desert. Instead, he found gardens, orchards, and fields of grain fed by no river he could see. Sargon's scribes recorded what baffled the king. The water came from beneath the earth, channeled through tunnels that stretched for kilometres into the mountains. The defeated ruler, Ursa, had built an underground system so precisely engineered that it delivered water using nothing but gravity. No pumps, no wheels, no fuel of any kind. That system was called a qanat. And here is the detail that should stop anyone who reads it. Variants of that same technology, built across the Iranian plateau over the following centuries, are still delivering water today, not as museum exhibits or reconstructions, as functioning infrastructure. 37,000 of them, collectively supplying roughly 15% of Iran's water needs. The question no one seems willing to answer is not how they were built. It is why they were abandoned. I found the inscription because I was looking for something else entirely. I was trying to trace how ancient Persian water systems compared to Roman aqueducts, and I kept finding a technology that predated Rome by centuries and outlasted it by millennia. The research pulled me sideways, as the best research often does, into a body of engineering literature I had not expected to find, and a history that became harder and harder to reconcile with the story we tell ourselves about progress. The qanat is, at its simplest, a gently sloping tunnel dug from an underground water source to the surface of a settlement, sometimes tens of kilometres away. The gradient is everything. A fall of 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,500 maintained across the entire length of the tunnel, calculated without levels, without theodolites, without any of the instruments we would consider essential for such precision. The builders used plumb lines, oil lamps, and geometry passed from father to son across generations. The water moves by gravity alone, which means there is nothing to break, nothing to fuel, and nothing to replace. If the tunnel is maintained, the water flows. It has flowed in some cases for thousands of years. The Achaemenid emperors understood what they had. Beginning around the 6th century BCE, the Persian crown offered a tax exemption lasting 5 generations to anyone who built a new qanat or brought a dead one back to life. I want to be careful about that figure because 5 generations is not a metaphor. It is a policy instrument of extraordinary ambition, one that tells us the Achaemenids understood qanat construction as multi-generational infrastructure and were prepared to forego revenue across roughly 150 years to incentivize it. The result was an explosion of underground engineering across the Iranian plateau and eventually far beyond it. The men who built the qanats were called muqannis, and their craft was hereditary, dangerous, and astonishingly precise. H. E. Wolfe, writing in Scientific American in 1968, documented their methods. The vertical shafts sunk at intervals along the tunnel line to provide ventilation and access, the oil lamps used to detect oxygen depletion, the hand signals passed between workers in tunnels so narrow that a man could not turn around. Henry Goblow's 1979 study corroborated and extended this picture, tracing the muqanni tradition across centuries and national borders with a thoroughness that remains the standard reference in the field to this day. The Gonabad qanat in northeastern Iran is perhaps the most extraordinary single example. It is 33 kilometres long, and its deepest shaft reaches 300 metres below the surface. It has 427 vertical shafts along its length and has been delivering water continuously for approximately 2,500 years. UNESCO inscribed it as a World Heritage Site in 2016. I have read the inscription documentation carefully, and what strikes me is the understatement. The language treats the Gonabad qanat as a cultural monument. It is also still a working water system. At their peak, qanats supplied roughly 75% of all water used in Iran, a figure that comes from Wolf and has been cited in the engineering literature for decades. The technology spread to approximately 35 countries across 3 continents, adapted under local names: Foggara in North Africa, Falaj in Oman, Karez in Afghanistan and Western China. Each variant describes the same fundamental principle of gravity, gradient, patience, and not a single moving part. Everything I have described so far is a story of success. What follows is a story of something else. Here is where the history becomes difficult to explain as mere neglect. Iran once had an estimated 70,000 functioning qanats. Today that number is closer to 37,000, and many of those are in decline. The loss did not happen slowly, over centuries of gradual obsolescence. It happened within living memory. The qanats did not fail, did not collapse or silt up beyond repair. In most cases, the tunnels remained structurally intact. What happened is that motorized wells were drilled beside them, sometimes within meters, and those wells drew water from the same aquifers that fed the qanats. As the water table dropped, the qanats went dry, not because they were poorly engineered, because the resource they were designed to carry was pumped out from underneath them. I have spent a long time trying to find the right word for this, and I keep returning to the same uncomfortable conclusion. What do we call it when a system that has worked for 3,000 years is not outperformed, but starved of the resource it was designed to carry? The standard narrative frames this as modernization, as progress, as the inevitable replacement of ancient methods by superior technology. But the deeper I looked into the record, the less that narrative held together. The motorized wells that replaced the qanats have an average operational lifespan of roughly 20 to 30 years, while the qanats they replaced had been operating for centuries. The wells require diesel or electricity, and the qanats required nothing. The wells deplete aquifers, and the qanats, by design, could only draw water at the rate the aquifer naturally recharged. The record does not support the story we have been told about modernization and progress. It supports something more uncomfortable. The critical period began in the early 1960s. In 1963, the Shah of Iran launched a program of sweeping reform known as the White Revolution, whose centerpiece was land redistribution. Large estates were broken up and parceled out to individual farmers. On paper, it was a social transformation. In practice, it dismantled the communal systems that had sustained qanat-based agriculture for centuries. I need to explain why the land reform mattered for water, because the connection is not immediately obvious to anyone outside the field. Qanats are communal by nature. A single qanat might serve dozens of farms, and the distribution of water between them was governed by intricate, locally administered schedules that had evolved over generations. In many villages, water allocation was managed using a fenjan, a traditional water clock that measured time by the slow filling of a copper bowl floating in a basin. Each family received water for a set duration, measured by the fenjan, and the system had been self-governing for as long as anyone could remember. The White Revolution broke the estates but offered no framework for maintaining the shared infrastructure those estates had supported, and the communal management structures withered within a decade. At the same time, a different kind of intervention was arriving from abroad. The United States Point 4 program, a Cold War-era technical assistance initiative, had been transferring deep well drilling technology to Iran since the 1950s. I am not suggesting this was done with the intention of destroying qanats. What I am saying is that the technology was introduced without any serious assessment of what it would displace, and that the consequences were predictable to anyone who understood how the existing systems worked. This was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, with secret meetings about abolishing ancient water networks. It was something more durable than a conspiracy. It was convergent interest dressed in the language of development. Consider a composite figure, drawn from the research of Paul Ward English, who studied qanat communities in the late 1960s. A farmer in a small village on the Iranian plateau, sometime around 1964, farming the same land his father farmed, irrigated by a qanat that his grandfather's generation helped maintain. The government offers him credit, backed by foreign aid, to purchase a diesel pump and sink a well. The pump delivers more water, faster, on his own schedule, with none of the communal waiting dictated by the Fenjan clock. He takes the loan. His neighbours do the same. The Fenjan falls silent. Within a decade, the aquifer beneath the village begins to drop. The qanat, which had tapped the water table at a sustainable depth for generations, can no longer reach it. The tunnel is sound and the shafts are intact, but the water is gone. The farmer is now dependent on diesel, on spare parts, on a supply chain that runs through Tehran and beyond. And when the pump breaks, he waits for a mechanic from the provincial capital. Mohammad Barshan, who has studied the decline of Iran's qanat network in considerable detail, has stated that approximately 35,000 qanats have been lost. That figure alone should be staggering, but the scale becomes clearer when set against more recent data. A study published in Nature Communications by Maghrebi and colleagues in 2023 documented a 50% decline in qanat discharge across Iran between 2006 and 2011 alone. 5 years. Half the remaining flow. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has described Iran's current water trajectory using a phrase that is not a metaphor. Water bankruptcy. Iran's groundwater reserves are being drawn down faster than they can recharge, and the infrastructure that once balanced extraction with natural replenishment has been systematically dismantled over the course of a single lifetime. How many of the engineers who arrived with drilling equipment in the 1950s and 60s ever asked a muqannis how the system they were replacing actually worked? I have not been able to find evidence that they did. What I have found consistently is the language of modernization applied without qualification to a process that replaced a self-sustaining system with a depleting one. Now consider the same village, one generation after the pump arrived. The diesel pump has itself been replaced twice, and the well has been drilled deeper each time as the water table fell further. The aquifer that once fed both the qanat and the surrounding ecosystem is severely depleted, and the young people have left for the cities. The Fenjan clock sits in a corner of someone's courtyard, its copper bowl green with neglect. And the qanat itself, 2,000 years old, structurally sound, its tunnel still perfectly graded, runs dry. Not because it failed, because a well drilled 20 metres from its mother shaft drained the aquifer it was designed to carry. Step away from the policy documents. Go back underground. Go back to the tunnel. There is a man lying on his side in a tunnel 60 centimetres wide, somewhere beneath the alluvial fans outside Gonabad during the late Achaemenid period. He is a muqannis, perhaps the 4th generation of his family to do this work. The air is close and warm and carries the faint mineral smell of wet stone. He has an oil lamp set in a niche carved into the tunnel wall, and he watches the flame with the same attention a sailor gives to wind. If the flame dims, the oxygen is failing, and he has minutes to retreat through a tunnel too narrow to turn around in. His tools are simple: a short-handled pickaxe, a leather bag for the spoil, a plumb line made of string and stone. He measures gradient by feel, by the way water pools when he pours a small amount onto the tunnel floor, by the geometry his father taught him using weighted strings and sighting lines. There is no written manual for any of this. The knowledge lives in his hands, in his eyes, in the way he reads the colour and texture of rock as it changes along the tunnel face. He has been digging for months, and the calculations say the aquifer is close. He chips at the rock and listens, and then it comes. A sound that begins as a whisper and builds to a rush. Water enters the tunnel, cold and fast, surging past him in the dark. He presses himself against the tunnel wall and lets it pass. Months of labour, distilled into a single moment of controlled danger. The water will flow through this tunnel for centuries after he is gone. He does not know this. He knows only that the work is done. The question I keep returning to is not whether the qanat can be saved. It is what it means that it needs saving at all. The muqannis' craft is dying. The tunnels he would have maintained are dry, and his knowledge is oral, carried in memory and gesture, rather than in any archive or library. The last generation of muqannis is aging in villages where no young person wants to learn a trade that has no tunnel left to serve. When the last muqanni dies without an apprentice, the knowledge does not pass into a book. It goes nowhere. It simply stops. The qanat's greatest virtue, the quality that sustained civilizations across 3,000 years and 35 countries, was its self-sufficiency. No fuel, no spare parts, no external dependency of any kind. That self-sufficiency made it invisible to planners who measured progress by energy consumption and commercial throughput. A system that needs nothing cannot be sold, cannot be metered, cannot be made dependent on a supply chain that someone, somewhere, profits from maintaining. This is not only a story about water, it is a story about what happens when a civilization defines progress as the replacement of systems that need nothing with systems that need everything. What do we call a civilization that dismantles the things that work and calls the dismantling progress? The tunnels are still drying, the knowledge is still dying, and the word for what replaced them is still called development.